The morning they threw Wen-mei off the Kessler ranch, the frost hadn't even burned off the grass yet, and she stood at the edge of the property with everything she owned wrapped in a single blanket bundle, watching the barn where she'd worked for 3 years grow smaller behind her as she walked the long dirt road toward town with no clear notion of where she'd sleep that night. She hadn't stolen anything, hadn't shirked a single chore in all her time there, hadn't done a thing wrong except show kindness to a wounded stranger who'd stumbled onto the property 2 days before, half frozen and bleeding from a gash along his ribs, and for that single act of mercy, Otis Kessler had called her ungrateful, foolish, and worse, before ordering his foreman to see her off his land before nightfall. When May had come to Wyoming Territory 4 years earlier with her father, part of a small community of Chinese laborers who'd worked the railroads until the lines were finished, and the companies no longer had use for the men who'd blasted tunnels through solid rock and laid track across country most folks back east couldn't have found on a map. Her father died the winter after they arrived, lungs finally giving out from years of coal dust and mountain air too thin for a body already weakened by hard labor, and she'd found work where she could, first in a laundry in town, and then, when Otis Kessler needed a cook and housekeeper cheap enough to suit his tight fist, on his ranch, doing work that was never once acknowledged with anything warmer than a grunt of acceptance when the meals came out right and a tongue-lashing when they didn't. The stranger had appeared on a Tuesday, staggering up from the direction of the eastern ridge with a wound along his side that looked, from the state of the dried blood crusting his shirt, to be at least a day old already, and when May had been the one to find him collapsed near the spring house when she went out for water before dawn. She didn't stop to consider who he was or where he'd come from or whether helping him might cost her anything, because that had never been how she was raised to think about another person's suffering. She'd hauled him, with strength she didn't know she had, into the spring house itself rather than the main house, both because it was closer and because some instinct told her Otis Kessler wouldn't take kindly to a bleeding stranger tracking blood across his good floors, and there she'd cleaned and stitched his wound with a needle and thread she kept for mending, using whiskey from the kitchen stores to clean it first, the same way her mother had taught her back in Guangdong before either of them had ever imagined a life in America. The man, when he finally woke enough to speak clearly, gave his name as Nathaniel, said little else about himself beyond that he'd been thrown from his horse somewhere along the ridge trail and struck his side against a rock outcropping hard enough to open the wound that had nearly killed him through blood loss and exposure both. He had the calloused hands of a working man, she noted, though something in the quality of his boots and the fine stitching of his belt suggested money somewhere in his life, even if his manner gave nothing else away. She fed him broth and kept the wound clean over the following 2 days, sneaking out to the spring house between her regular chores, careful to keep the whole business hidden from Otis Kessler, who she knew would see any charity extended to a stranger as charity stolen from his own household, time and food that rightly belonged to him even though he paid her little enough for either. It was the third morning that undid her, when Otis himself went out to the spring house looking for ice and found instead a strange man sleeping on a bed of blankets that had clearly been pulled from the main house's linen closet, tended by a servant girl he'd assumed was safely occupied with breakfast preparations. The scene that followed was ugly enough that when May still felt the sting of it weeks later, Otis shouting about thieves and vagrants and the gall of a hired girl making decisions about his property and his provisions without so much as asking permission, and when she tried to explain that the man had been dying, that she couldn't in good conscience have simply stepped over him and let him bleed out in the cold, Otis had waved the explanation away like smoke, said he didn't pay her to think, only to work, and that if she valued a stranger's life over her position on his ranch, then she was free to go find work wherever that stranger's life might take her instead. Nathaniel, weak as he still was, had tried to intervene, tried to explain that he'd insist on paying for whatever trouble he'd caused, but Otis had rounded on him too, telling him he wasn't welcome either and could clear off the property the moment he was fit to walk. And something in the set of Nathaniel's jaw as he absorbed that dismissal told when May, he wasn't a man accustomed to being spoken to that way. Though he said nothing further in his own defense, only watched with quiet, careful eyes as Otis ordered his foreman to see when May escorted off the land within the hour, her wages for the month forfeit as penalty for what he called her insubordination. She walked the 6 miles into town that day with nothing but her blanket bundle and the few coins she'd managed to save separately from her wages. hidden in a pouch sewn into her petticoat against exactly this kind of circumstance, because a woman alone in that territory learned quickly never to keep all her security in one place where a single bad morning could take it from her. She found a room above the laundry where she'd once worked, the owner, a kind widow named Mrs. Abernathy, extending credit against future work since she had no funds to spare for rent outright. And there when May sat that first night, staring at the low rafters, wondering what exactly she'd done wrong in a world that seemed to punish kindness as readily as cruelty, and finding, despite everything, that she couldn't bring herself to regret helping the stranger, whatever it had cost her. She didn't see Nathaniel again for nearly 2 weeks, and in that time she rebuilt what pieces of a life she could, taking in mending and laundry, helping Mrs. Abernathy with the heavier washing, saving every coin toward some vague future she hadn't yet allowed herself to properly imagine. It was on a Sunday, walking back from the small mission church at the edge of town, that she saw him again, and barely recognized him at first, dressed now in a fine gray coat and polished boots, standing beside a matched pair of horses hitched to a handsome buggy, deep in conversation with the town's banker as though the two were old and comfortable acquaintances. She might have walked past without a word, might have let the moment pass entirely rather than intrude on whatever business had brought a well-dressed stranger to town, except that he caught sight of her first, and the way his whole face changed, breaking into something warm and genuinely pleased, stopped her mid-step before she could decide otherwise. "Miss May," he said, crossing to her with none of the weakness that had marked his movements when last she'd seen him. "I've been trying to learn where you'd gone. Kessler wouldn't say, and I confess I feared the worst, that you might have found yourself in real difficulty on my account." She told him, plainly enough, that she'd found work and lodging both, that she'd managed well enough despite losing her position, careful to keep any note of bitterness from her voice, even though the memory of that morning still stung whenever she let herself dwell on it. It was the banker standing nearby who let slip, in the easy manner of a man discussing common knowledge, exactly who Nathaniel was, that the ranch he owned 3 valleys over ran more cattle than any 3 outfits in the territory combined, that half the businesses in town carried loans backed by his capital, and that the Nathaniel Ashcroft, standing before her, whom she'd tended with whiskey and thread in a borrowed springhouse, was in fact one of the wealthiest ranchers in the entire territory, a man whose name alone could open or close doors across half the county depending on how he chose to speak it. When May felt something like embarrassment rise in her at the revelation, not because she regretted helping him, but because she realized suddenly how simple and small her care must have looked to a man of such means, a bowl of broth and rough stitching from a servant girl with nothing else to offer. But Nathaniel, watching her face, seemed to read exactly what she was thinking, and was quick to correct whatever assumption he saw forming. "You didn't tend to a rich man that day," he said, low enough that only she could hear it clearly. "You tended to a man bleeding half to death in the cold, who might well have died before anyone else thought to look for him. My money never once entered into what you did for me, and I won't have you thinking it should have mattered." He asked, then, plainly and without preamble, whether she might consider coming to work at his own ranch, not as a servant in the sense Kessler had used the word, but as housekeeper with full authority over the running of his household, wages triple what Kessler had ever paid her, and her own private quarters rather than a shared bunk in a drafty outbuilding. She hesitated, wary of trading one form of dependence for another, wary too of accepting charity dressed up as employment, but something in the steadiness of his offer, the way he made clear it was compensation for skill and character rather than pity for her circumstance, eventually won her over, and within the month she found herself installed in a household far grander than anything she'd known since leaving her family's modest home in Guangdong, running a staff of her own with an authority Otis Kessler would never have dreamed of extending to her. The months that followed brought a kind of steadiness to her life she hadn't known was possible in this country that had taken her father and offered her so little in return for years of labor. Nathaniel proved to be exactly the kind of employer his reputation suggested, fair in his dealings, quick to reward good work, and slow to anger even when mistakes were made. And when May found herself, almost without noticing the transition, coming to genuinely respect the man whose life she'd once saved on instinct alone, without any thought of what he might one day be able to offer in return. Their conversations, at first limited strictly to household matters, gradually widened over shared meals he insisted she take at his table rather than in the kitchen, into discussions of books and politics and the wider world. And when May began to understand that Nathaniel Ashcroft, for all his wealth, was a genuinely lonely man, widowed young and childless, who had built an empire of cattle and capital with no one particular to share it with. It was nearly a year after that first morning at the spring house that Nathaniel finally spoke plainly about feelings he'd apparently been nursing in silence for longer than when May had realized, telling her over a quiet dinner one evening that he'd never forgotten the particular fierceness with which she'd fought to save a stranger's life, that he'd watched her since in every capacity she'd served in his household and found himself against every expectation of propriety that governed a man of his standing, falling in love with her steady courage and her unbending sense of what was right regardless of cost. When May, who had guarded her own feelings carefully through the months of their growing friendship, understanding well enough the vast distance between a wealthy rancher and a laborer's orphan daughter, admitted in turn that she'd come to feel something similar, though she'd never allowed herself to hope it might be spoken aloud or returned. Word of their eventual marriage traveled fast through a territory hungry for gossip of any kind, and not everyone received the news kindly, certain circles making their disapproval known in ways both subtle and blunt. But Nathaniel's standing was substantial enough, and his conviction unwavering enough, that the disapproval amounted to little more than idle talk that faded within a season or two, unable to find purchase against a marriage built on genuine partnership rather than any calculation either party might have been suspected of making. Otis Kessler, when word reached him of who exactly his former servant girl had married, was said to have gone pale as a sheet, understanding at last the magnitude of what his cruelty and pride had cost him. Not merely a hard-working servant dismissed for a moment's kindness, but any future goodwill from a man whose financial reach touched half the businesses in the territory, including, as it happened, the very bank holding the note on Kessler's own increasingly troubled ranch. When May never sought out revenge against the man who'd thrown her off his land with nothing but a blanket and forfeited wages, never used her new position or her husband's influence to see Kessler ruined out of spite, though she knew well enough that a single word from her could likely have accomplished exactly that. Instead, she built a life focused forward rather than backward, establishing within a few years a small school on the Ashcroft property for children of the laborers and ranch hands in the area, regardless of their background or their family station, remembering keenly what it had meant to grow up without such opportunities available to her, and determined that no child under her care or influence would ever face the particular loneliness of an education denied. She and Nathaniel raised 2 children of their own in the years that followed, both of whom grew up understanding, through stories told and retold at the family table, that their mother's greatest achievement wasn't the grand house she eventually came to run or the wealth that surrounded them, but a single act of mercy shown to a bleeding stranger on a frozen morning, offered without any thought of reward, precisely because that was the only kind of kindness when May had ever believed was worth extending to anyone at all. And when she was an old woman, long after Nathaniel had passed and their children had children of their own, she would tell anyone who asked that the day Otis Kessler threw her off his ranch had felt, at the time, like the worst morning of her life, and had turned out, in the strange and unpredictable way that fate sometimes arranges these things, to be the very best one.